Hello, everybody. It's been a while since I've been up here lecturing, so I'm going to try to make this brief, or at least as brief as possible. This is an introduction to our next and final major piece we'll be working with this semester, Homer's The Odyssey. One of the most important literary works in Western literature because the Odyssey established the format and the formula for the quest narrative and the hero's journey, which we'll talk about a bit more as we go on through our examination of the Odyssey. So, first off, some background information on Homer. Homer is attributed as the author of the Odyssey. Homer was a legendary ancient Greek poet and bard. And what I mean by legendary is that a lot of what is believed or known about Homer really comes from legend. There's not a lot, we don't really know a lot of biographical information about Homer. There's not a lot in the historical record to basically explain what his life was like. There's minimal historical evidence of his existence. Even he's mentioned in sources by other people, but there's not a lot of evidence to definitively establish that he even existed in the first place. Kind of like Socrates, but most historians generally accept that Homer or somebody like Homer existed. So for all intents and purposes, we'll accept the very limited information we have about Homer as fact. What we do know, or what is in the record about Homer, is that he was apparently blind, was an amazing storyteller, and he's known today primarily for creating the two epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Has more works than that, but as is quite common with ancient Greek literature, a lot of them have most likely been lost. A prime example of that would be the playwright Sophocles, who wrote plays like Oedipus Rex and Antigone. But Sophocles wrote apparently 70-some plays, and only 4 have survived to the present day. So quite possibly there have been a lot of Greek epics and other Greek literature, other pieces of Greek literature that have just been lost to history. What's important to note about Greek storytelling is that the Greek epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, were originally passed down orally. They were not written down, and they were instead memorized and then recited by storytellers. Bards like Homer, who would recite these epics at festivals and religious ceremonies. These stories were not short, by the way. They're pretty long, and they were not written down for centuries after they were first composed. What's also notable is they're poems. They don't feel like poems when you read them. They don't sound like poems. They don't rhyme. Shakespeare is way more stylized than Homer. But there is a meter and a rhythm to it. They are written and spoken in verse. And I think part of the reason for that stems from the fact that things written in verse are just easier to memorize. So if you knew you were coming up with a story that needed to be memorized and would only be passed down orally, you'd want to make it easier to memorize it, easier for other people to memorize your story. Hence why it would be spoken in verse. And the way storytellers would basically work in ancient Greece is they would have to listen to the story be told multiple times until they could memorize it and then recite it themselves. And thus the stories would be passed down. So, on to what epics are as not necessarily a genre, well, I guess a mini genre. So epics are long, large-scale stories that address important themes and subjects. These are two examples of more recent epics, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Both of these would be considered epics, even though they're not set in the ancient world and come from more recent sources. Lord of the Rings is this sprawling fantasy adventure that goes all over Tolkien's fictional continent of Middle-earth, deals with this massive conflict between good and evil, light and dark, and tackles a lot of pretty heavy themes like honor, corruption, good and evil, and things like that. Whereas Hugo's Les Miserables from the mid-1800s chronicles the story of Jean Valjean as he has forced to navigate the rather difficult and sometimes chaotic post-revolutionary France landscape, and dealing with more complex themes like redemption, the difference between justice and law, like what does it mean to be a good person, and other things like that. Epics focus on heroic figures. Their heroes, their protagonists are called epic heroes for a reason. They're heroic. They're not necessarily relatable. They're not that human. They're more superhuman, which we'll talk more about epic heroes later on. Epics represent the values of the cultures they are written for, and they do that to teach lessons. Again, Lord of the Rings is heavily informed by the post-World War II mindset and the decline of the British Empire after World War II. And that's reflected in the writing, where there's this sense of faded grandeur and the decline of past glory. Whereas Les Miserables is very heavily informed by the culture and the landscape of post-revolutionary France. And there's a lot of social commentary in the novel on issues affecting post-revolutionary France. The epics are written in a grand tone that conveys the importance of the story. The way they're written, it's meant to inspire you, to get the reader or the audience to recognize the subject as important, that this means something and it should be taken seriously. And epics tend to be heavily grounded in and inspired by mythology, history, folk tales, and legends. Like the Odyssey, for example, is heavily grounded in Greek mythology, but also elements of Greek history like the Trojan War. Lord of the Rings draws heavily from medieval history and culture and a lot of medieval mythology, from things like Norse mythology and Old English mythological or legendary epics like Beowulf. Les Miserables, by contrast, is heavily influenced by the history of the French Revolution and the culture of France throughout the 1800s. So, while all epics generally have those same general characteristics, the Greek epics share a number of other additional similarities. First off, the Greek epics were poems. Again, these were epic poems. They were written in verse, originally passed down orally. Greek epics center around epic heroes. An epic hero is a character with extraordinary or superhuman abilities and capabilities. It's a character that the reader is meant to look up to and not relate to. The Greeks didn't really write stories about regular people because they kind of thought that regular people were boring. Instead, they focused more on what we would call, or what would be perceived as like super people or superhumans. People who were better than regular people, that regular people would want to look up to and want to be like. Greek epics generally endorsed and depicted the major Greek values of honor, bravery, intelligence, respect for the gods, loyalty to one's home and family, while their heroes generally shared the same major fault, that of hubris or ego or arrogance. And hubris manifested itself in a variety of different ways in Greek literature, notably through things like disrespect for the gods, a lack of hospitality, or excessive pride. Usually, a hero's overconfidence or arrogance would cause them to make a mistake that would lead to their downfall. Some other secondary traits of Greek epics. Many begin what's called the term used here is in medias res, which is Latin to refer to. Okay, let's try that again. Many Greek epics begin in medias res, which is a Latin term that means in the middle of things. What this means is that they start in the middle of the story, then flash back to the beginning, and then go forward from the beginning, showing the reader or the audience how the character got to that point that we saw them at the start of the story, while also continuing on to the end. The Odyssey is one such example of a story that begins in medias res. Another good recent example that's come up a couple of times in person in class of a movie that does this is Deadpool. The first Deadpool movie begins in medias res, where it starts with his conflict on the highway, and then it flashes back to show how he got to that point, and then it continues on to finish his story. These stories also begin with an invocation to a god or several gods. Again, storytelling was a major component of Greek festivals and religious celebrations. So, because of that, the stories themselves would begin with invocations, signifying that they were meant to be interpreted as offerings to this god or the gods that were being worshipped or celebrated, while also asking the god to help the storyteller recite the story properly and to tell it well. They also state the major theme of the story at the beginning. From the beginning, they tell you what the story is about. And Greek epics feature long, formal speeches spoken by a lot of different characters. There's a lot of characters in these stories, and they like to talk. Hence why I have Syndrome from The Incredibles up here, because very, very often the characters get monologuing. Speaking of characters, let's look over some of the characteristics of the epic hero. So the epic hero is superhuman. They're not relatable. They're meant to inspire and set an example. The Greeks meant for epic heroes to be viewed not like the audience or not like the listener, but better than the listener. Prime examples of modern day epic heroes would be superheroes, characters like Superman. Superman is not all that relatable. Instead, his purpose is meant to be an example, is meant to inspire us to want to be like him. The epic hero is on a quest seeking something of great value, or they're trying to do something that is important to them. Basically, they're going on a journey and they're trying to do something that they think is really important. During this quest, the hero faces and overcomes trials and tribulations. Things that push them to their limits, but because of their superhuman capabilities, they're able to overcome that and eventually keep pushing forward towards their goal. Particularly in Greek epics, the epic hero is a mixture of human and divine, meaning that one of their parents would be a god or some other supernatural or superhuman figure. And 9 times out of 10, when it comes to Greek mythology, that god who would father the hero would be Zeus. Most of the famous Greek heroes were fathered by Zeus. Over the course of their quest, villains will place obstacles in the way to try and stop the hero from getting what they want. And the hero usually will overcome that, but sometimes not. Sometimes they'll fail. And if they fail, it's because of their tragic flaw. Even when Greek heroes succeeded, they would still have a tragic flaw that the Greeks referred to as hamartia, their tragic flaw. And that could differ from hero to hero, but almost always it came back to this notion of hubris or arrogance and overconfidence. Since Greek epics are heavily grounded in mythology, it's worth going over what myths are and kind of where they came from. So a myth is just a traditional story from a specific culture. Mythology is not unique to ancient Greece. All cultures have their own myths. For example, in the US, there's the myth of Paul Bunyan, who was not a real figure, but is instead a mythological frontiersman meant to teach the virtues of the American frontier. The Greek myths have generally persisted for so long, I think for a couple of reasons. One, because they're legitimately really interesting. But two, since a lot of Western culture has its roots in ancient Greece, they've kind of just lasted and continued on through that. The purpose of myths is to convey cultural values, so basically teach people important lessons about how to act and how to effectively be as a person, to establish a tradition or a ritual, or provide an explanation for why a certain tradition exists, or to try and explain a mysterious natural phenomenon, like why the sun rises and sets, why there are earthquakes, what lightning is. And I think to understand this perspective, it helps if you put yourself in the position of somebody in ancient Greece who does not have all the benefit of all the scientific knowledge we have about why the world works the way it works. But instead, just not really knowing why the giant ball of fire moves across the sky every day, or why the ground sometimes shakes and destroys structures. And over time, myths come about trying to provide a sort of explanation for that to make the world less scary. So why does the sun rise and set? Well, because Apollo pulls it across the sky every day. Why do earthquakes happen, or what are earthquakes? Well, they're caused by Poseidon when he gets angry. What are thunderbolts? They're thrown by Zeus when he gets angry. Generally, the purpose of myths is they try to provide an explanation and a structure for the unknown. When we don't know something, we subconsciously and naturally try to find an explanation for it. And I think that's where the root of all mythology really stems from. They're trying to explain what they can't explain by any other means. In the process, the Greeks just happened to come up with some really interesting stories. Speaking of interesting stories, when it comes to Greek mythology, there are some common characteristics of Greek myths. For example, Greek myths frequently focus on the weaknesses or failures of humanity. Most commonly, greed, pride, and cruelty. And they sought to show how, through these three character flaws, greed, pride, and cruelty, otherwise good people could become corrupted and meet their downfalls. Again, King Midas generally was a pretty good king, but he was greedy, and that greed eventually consumed him and destroyed him. The Greek myths were not really that spiritual, even though they incorporated the gods and their religious figures. They weren't trying to provide spiritual clarity, and they weren't trying to teach spiritual lessons. They were instead trying to provide explanations for the natural world, or trying to teach important character traits. Most commonly, humility. Humility. Don't be arrogant. Don't be overconfident. And this kind of reflects some differences between Greek culture and the Greek religion and modern culture. The Greeks were polytheistic, meaning they worshipped multiple gods. The main Greek pantheon consists of 12 different gods that were generally worshipped by all the Greeks, whereas there were many other lesser gods or lesser deities that were worshipped by individual city-states or individual regions or small groups of the population. And the Greeks view their gods as kind of reflections of humanity. The Greek gods shared very similar characteristics with humans, and they frequently used their power for selfish ends. Another way to think of it, the Greek gods had all the greed, pride, and cruelty of humans. They just had divine powers to back them up. Hence why a lot of Greek mythology and a lot of Greek stories stem from a god being angry with a mortal for being better than them at something, and then using their powers to try and get revenge on that mortal. Fundamentally, Greek religion was served primarily a cultural focus and not necessarily a cultural purpose and not necessarily a spiritual purpose. Greek religion and Greek mythology were viewed as a way to build a common culture to bind the Greeks together. If you think about the way ancient Greece was set up and divided up into all these different city-states, it makes a lot of sense why the religion and the mythology would be used and viewed as a way to kind of bind all these different parts of Greece together and to get them to kind of put aside some of their some of the differences that they might have because of their different individual city-states. Anyway, on to the Odyssey itself and what the Odyssey actually is. So the Odyssey is the sequel to Homer's other famous epic poem, the Iliad. The Iliad focuses on the final days of the Trojan War. And the Iliad is also a very important work in Western literature. Like how the Odyssey kind of set the format for the quest narrative and the hero's journey, the Iliad set the model for the war epic. So the Iliad is really about war, while the Odyssey is about a journey and a quest. In this case, specifically, it's the story of Odysseus, who is a veteran of the Trojan War, who is on his who is on his journey home from the war, and it takes him 10 years to get home. So just some background on the Trojan War and on the Iliad itself. So for a while, there was doubt as to whether or not Troy actually ever even really existed, and whether or not the Trojan War had ever actually happened. But within the past several decades, historians and archaeologists have uncovered evidence of the city of Troy and evidence that the Trojan War probably actually happened. Although, more than likely, it did not actually happen as recorded in the Iliad. But for the purposes of looking at the Odyssey, we only really need to look at how it's depicted in the Iliad, since the Odyssey is the sequel to the Iliad. So, within the Iliad, Homer describes the Trojan War as being fought primarily over a woman. Helen was the wife of Menelaus, who was the king of Sparta, and she leaves him and runs away with Paris, the younger prince of Troy. Menelaus is angry at this, angry at Helen for leaving him, and is also angry at Troy for taking her hand and basically luring her away. So he goes to seek help from his older brother Agamemnon, who is the king of Mycenae. And Agamemnon decides to help him out by building a giant army of representatives across all of Greece. Agamemnon builds this gigantic Greek army, and they set forth and lay a 10-year-long siege against Troy. So Troy was surrounded by these massive, nigh impenetrable walls, and within the city walls, they had everything they needed. They were totally self-sufficient. They had enough farmland to raise their own food. They had access to a reasonable water supply. Troy was nigh impenetrable, and the Trojans could basically just sit behind the walls and wait for the Greeks to tire themselves out and just give up. And the Iliad picks up near the end of the war, in the final days of the war. So at this point, the Greeks have been besieging Troy for 10 years, and they are about ready to just call it quits and go home. They're saved, and the siege is broken through the ingenuity of Odysseus. Odysseus is a different type of Greek hero, whereas most Greek heroes like Hercules, for example, are known primarily for their strength or their power in battle, like Achilles. Odysseus was known primarily for his intelligence and his ability to think his way out of problems. Odysseus realizes that the walls of Troy are too strong, they'll never break through. Instead, they need to find another way to get inside the city. And Odysseus comes up with the strategy of what's become known as the Trojan horse, where basically the Greeks are going to pretend like they're giving up and they're going home. They're going to build a gigantic, hollow wooden horse left behind, apparently as a peace offering to the Trojans and as an offering to Poseidon, requesting safe passage home. Within the horse, a number of warriors will hide while the rest of the Greek army goes away to hide from the Trojans and make it seem like they've gone home and they've just left. The Trojans would then bring the horse inside the city walls, and at night, the warriors inside, led by Odysseus, would come out of the horse, open the city gates to let the rest of the Greeks in, and the city would fall. And that is exactly what happened. The plan worked exactly according to plan. Through Odysseus' ingenuity, the Greeks won the Trojan War, although the legendary warrior Achilles died, stemming from the injury to his Achilles heel, hence why that part of the foot is called the Achilles tendon today. And this is just a map of the Greek world, and the world of the Iliad. So here again, you have the cities of Mycenae and Sparta, which were the main Greek city-states waging the war. And then over here is Troy. So if you've done the math, Odysseus was at war and besieging Troy for 10 years. And then it takes him 10 more years to get home from the war. So by the time Odysseus gets home, he's been gone for 20 years, which is pretty unfortunate for him, considering that he didn't even want to go to war in the first place and tried to get out of it. Odysseus is the ruler of Ithaca here. And back home in Ithaca, he has a wife, Penelope, and a son, Telemachus. And Odysseus, while known as a great strategist and is highly intelligent, he, like many Greek heroes, makes the mistake of being overconfident and inadvertently offends the god of the sea, Poseidon, who, as punishment for his offense, prevents him from returning home to Ithaca for 10 years. So the reason why it takes him 10 years to get home is because he has angered Poseidon. And that's the story. That's the very general outline of the Odyssey. Over the course of those 10 years, Odysseus is basically forced to wander through the Mediterranean, encountering various people, places, creatures, and going on all sorts of adventures. So, the Odyssey's pretty cool. We're not going to read the entire thing. It's too long. But we are going to read the major parts of it. We will start going through that next week. If you have any questions about this, let me know as soon as possible. With that, have a good weekend, and I will talk to you later.